Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Chris Perry, Executive Director of the First 5 Years Fund. It's our pleasure to host this webinar to discuss our 4th annual National Public Opinion Poll on early childhood education. The First 5 Years Fund works with policymakers, experts, business leaders, and advocates to advance federal investment in quality early childhood education for disadvantaged children from birth to age 5. Research is important to us, whether it's scientific or opinion related. The First 5 Years Fund believes that quality early childhood education is a necessity for today's families, and the federal government should support states as they invest in new or expanded early childhood education programs. American voters believe this as well. In fact, voters have identified early education as a national priority with remarkable consistency, regardless of party, for 4 years running. What is so striking is their unity in the midst of what is characterized as an angry and polarized election. 90% of voters agree on one thing: Congress and the next president should work together to make quality early childhood education more accessible and affordable to low and middle income families. This demand for a solution is driven by an understanding that early childhood is the most important time to build a foundation for later success in school and life. It's also driven by frustration that the critical opportunity of early childhood education from birth to age 5 is limited by cost and access to quality. Policymakers from both parties would be wise to meet voter demand with action. Our research shows that a candidate's position on early education matters to voters, and a number of key voter segments are particularly impressed by a candidate who supports the issue, including Latinos, moms, and suburban women. While it is true that some voters are angry, we find that the vast majority want policymakers to work on solutions that improve their lives and communities. Early childhood education is one of those solutions, and a top priority both for those who want solutions and those who want to vent their anger. I'd like to introduce you to our bipartisan polling team to share this year's results in detail. We're pleased to work with Lori Weigel, a partner with Public Opinion Strategies, and Jay Campbell, Senior Vice President of Hart Research. Lori and Jay?
Thank you very much, Chris. This is Jay Campbell, Senior Vice President of Hart Research Associates. I'm going to talk about the front-end results of the survey and then pass to Lori Weigel from Public Opinion Strategies, and she'll pick up about halfway through. Briefly, to give everyone an understanding of how this research was conducted, we did a national survey via telephone, both landline and cell phone, of 800 registered voters across the country. This is the same methodology we've used 3 years prior to this survey as well. All of the interviewing was done in late May, so this is nice, fresh data. And it is, of course, representative of the national electorate from a demographic and geographic standpoint. And just to emphasize one more time, this research is and always has been done on a bipartisan basis between Lori's Republican firm, Public Opinion Strategies, and my Democratic firm, Hart Research Associates. We've worked together since the inception of this poll for First 5 Years Fund, as well as on many other projects together, and our bipartisan partnership is in fact reflected in the results, as Chris noted, which we will talk about shortly. Next slide, please. Being that this is a presidential election year and a unique one at that, we wanted to get a sense of the temperament of the electorate as context for the data related to early childhood education specifically. And so we asked a question of respondents early in the survey. We asked, would you prefer a president who focuses more on solutions to the country's problems, but who doesn't share voters' angers and frustration with the political system? Or would you prefer someone who shares voters' anger and frustration with the system, but who focuses less on finding solutions to the country's problems? Despite, again, the very unique environment that we find ourselves in this election year, by a 3-to-1 margin, voters come down very strongly on the side of wanting to find solutions to the problem. This is across the board. It's true of both genders. It's true of older and younger voters, white and non-white voters, and voters in every region of the country. And if we go to the next slide, we can see it's even true across party lines to a certain degree. There is perhaps a very slightly larger desire to have a candidate who reflects frustration from Republicans than from Democrats, but by and large, 60% plus across the board, and up to 75% of Democrats want a candidate who will find solutions to the country's problems. And we know the anger is out there. My firm and Lori's firm did another survey a couple of weeks ago for CNBC in which we found over 80% of voters are either angry or dissatisfied with the political system in Washington, and that anger and dissatisfaction does go across the board on a partisan basis as well. But the important point to take away from this is that frustration in voters' mind does not equal stagnation. They still want to see progress. The next slide provides us with a pretty good sense of some of the things that people would like to see accomplished. We asked this question of everyone and gave them a list of top issues and asked in general whether they see this as important personally to themselves for the country to achieve this goal or not. And the data we see is for the percentages who say that each goal is extremely or very important. As Chris noted, you look at the second item on the list, which is actually on par with the top several items on the list, making sure that our children get a strong start in life through quality early childhood education. This is an extremely important priority across the board, and actually rates as high as job creation, as high as education in general, and the quality of public education, and as high as health care or decreasing the number of people in poverty. It in fact comes out well ahead of fixing the immigration system, providing no-cost or low-cost college, or reducing the tax burden. And an important point to note here, which is not actually reflected in the slide, but if we think back to those angry voters and those solutions-based voters that I mentioned a few slides ago, both the angry voters and the solution-based voters, in excess of 80% of each group, approximately, say that making sure children get a strong start in life through quality early childhood education is very important to them personally. So not only do people want solutions to the country's problems, there's actually fairly broad agreement certainly on many of these, but in particular on the early childhood education item, that this is an important priority to set our sights on. Next slide, please. And as Chris noted, one of the highest numbers we found in the poll, and one of the areas where agreement is the most broad, is that people say, regardless of which party controls each branch of government next year, 90% of the public say that the president and the next Congress should work together to improve access to early childhood education. And in point of fact, 73% feel strongly that that is the case. There's virtually no disagreement on this point, and there is agreement across the partisan spectrum that this is the case. And indeed, if we go to the next slide, there's agreement from both supporters of Donald Trump and supporters of Hillary Clinton that this is the case as well. We did not ask this question in the traditional horse race sense. We didn't ask people who they would intend to vote for, who they'd rather see as president between these two candidates. We just asked people straight up for each one. Do you consider yourself a Donald Trump supporter? Do you consider yourself a Hillary Clinton supporter? And the numbers in parentheses underneath the sets of bars in each case are the percentages who said yes to those. So 35% consider themselves a Clinton supporter, 32% consider themselves a Trump supporter. In some ways, because of the way we asked the question, these are the true core supporters of each one of these candidates, as opposed to those who are just sort of voting against the other candidate, which is oftentimes the case in many traditional horse race questions. But regardless of which candidate people support, they overwhelmingly do want that, provided that that candidate becomes the next president, they want that candidate to work with the Congress to make early childhood education more accessible and more available to families across the country. Next slide, please. Again, Chris alluded to this. There is wide recognition across the spectrum that early learning is really important. The earliest ages of a child's life are most important for developing a capacity to learn, which is how we asked the question. We gave people a list of children's ages and said, which one of these do you see as being the most important to develop a capacity to learn? And 72% said children ages birth to 5 is the most important age range in this regard. And that includes 50%, by the way, who said ages 3 to 5 being the most important, and 22% who said under age 3 was the most important. In some ways, this is an obvious answer to the question when you're asking about a capacity to learn. But it's truly, I don't have exact data to compare to, but just anecdotally, the work I've been doing over the past 16 years in this particular space, people did not always recognize the vast importance of the earliest years for children's learning. It is something they've come to slowly, but the public is very much there right now and strongly believes in how important those early years are. On the next slide, we can also see something that Chris alluded to. She called it a frustration, which may in fact be true, that there is, at the very least, a recognition that high-quality, affordable programs for lower and middle-income families are very much lacking. We asked people in their own area if they could say what percentage or what proportion of early childhood programs meet those two criteria, being both high quality and affordable for lower and middle income families. The plurality of the public, 45%, said only some or very few of programs in their areas actually meet that criteria. Only about a quarter said that all or most of the programs in their area meet that criteria. And this gets, by the way, more severe. The lower the income of the respondent, the more likely they are to say that there are few options that are both high quality, affordable in their area. And it's particularly, seems to be particularly acute in urban areas, much more so than in rural areas. Very briefly on the next slide, this is a question we've asked each of the 4 times we've done this survey and gotten virtually equal results every single year, and that is more than 2 out of 3 respondents, 68% in fact in total, say that half of the children in this country go or less go to kindergarten without the knowledge and the skills that they need to do their best. Only 29% say that all or most children are ready for kindergarten by the time they get there. Again, this is an entirely consistent result for 4 years running, and it fits in very well with the previous slides. There's a recognized need for this type of education as outlined here and on the previous slide, and a strong belief that making sure that children have those skills and have that strong start is in fact a major goal for this country, or in fact should be. And the next slide partially explains why that is. People do see a range of benefits to children attending a high-quality early childhood educational experience. We read off a list of potential benefits, and large majorities of voters in each case say that attending high-quality early education helps in this area, either a lot or some. And these, as you can read through them, they range from academic benefits to social developmental ones, economic benefits. Some of them are shorter term and some of them are longer term. And to me, having done this work for so long, one of the most interesting is the third down on the list, children having academic success in middle and high school. There is a school of thought that early childhood education has major fade out for children who attend it, that high-quality education is maybe not worth the investment because by 3rd grade many children lose any benefits that they would have obtained. The public clearly does not see it that way. 72% said that they see those benefits continuing and helping children achieve academic success in both middle and high school. They do not believe that that fade-out exists. And this is equally true of both people who have children and those who do not, by the way, which is also kind of an interesting point. Before I pass it to Lori, I have one more slide to talk about, and that is where people's educational priorities are. We asked people if, by their reckoning, if it would be better to invest more in college education when children are finishing their education and starting to decide on their careers, or in early education when children are beginning school and creating the foundation for their educational experience? That's how we ask the question. Or we ask, should both investments be made equally? And in point of fact, the majority of the public, 51%, would like to see equal investments made in each case. But those who choose one side or the other by a 2-to-1 margin say that the investment should be more focused on the early education rather than college education. And this is, in fact, parents, even more so than children who do not, people who do not have children, would like to see those investments in early education. And I think this is particularly significant in a year when the cost and access issues related to college education have gotten more political attention than in any year since I entered politics, certainly, 20 years ago. And even with that level of focus on the cost of college education, there is an equal focus and perhaps a slightly greater focus on the part of the public on cost and access issues related to early childhood education at the beginning of children's educational careers. With that, and with the next slide, I'm going to pass to Lori Weigel of Public Opinion Strategies.
Thank you, Jay. So we've seen that there's a very strong foundation in terms of support, in terms of seeing benefits, in terms of respondents telling us that early education is something that they value. We wanted to get more specific and understand, okay, if there was a tangible, potentially, proposal sometime in the future, how would they respond then? Especially one that places a price tag on this specific investment. We basically took a generic amount, a significant one though, of $10 billion per year for 10 years, and asked respondents to tell us if that was a plan that would help state and local communities provide these types of better early childhood education programs to low and moderate income parents in this key range of birth to age 5, then how would they respond? And you can see on the next slide that we had significant support. Almost 3/4 of the electorate told us that this type of a plan, even with that very significant price tag on it, they would support it. In fact, almost half, 47%, indicated strong support. It was fewer than 1 in 4 that told us that they opposed it, and almost no one was unsure of how they felt about this. That didn't surprise us this time because, as you can see on the next slide, we have seen that very, very strong and consistent support over the years. We've asked variations of this particular proposal with always including a price tag of this sort on it with somewhat slightly different wording depending on the year in which we find ourselves operating. But we've consistently seen this type of level, more than 7 in 10 American voters telling us that they support this type of investment to provide better early childhood education for low and moderate income families. Even more significant is the data on the next slide, that there is majority support across the partisan spectrum. We have seen that Republicans, a majority of them, and really any sort of massive investment in any sort of area is going to evoke somewhat of a partisan response. There's a reason they gave me this slide, I guess, to talk about it because of the Republican affiliation of my firm. But we've seen even more significant distinctions on other types of issues. This is one where a majority of Republicans are saying, yes, actually go ahead, invest $10 billion per year in this type of a program, and that doesn't come along every day. And we clearly have even stronger support among those key voters of independents, 7 in 10, and with universal support among Democrats. As well, on the next slide, there are key swing voter subgroups that are going to determine much of the outcome of this upcoming election. Voters like Latinos, we see suburban women are a key focus of our Senate candidates around the country, and 4 and 5 of them are indicating support. In fact, among our moderate Republicans, we have almost 2/3 support, and among GOP women, there's a lot of focus on Republican women right now in terms of the presidential race. 58% are indicating support for this type of significant investment in early childhood education. And even given the unusual year that we're in, you can see on the next slide that even those voters who told us initially that they were really looking for a candidate that expressed and shared their anger about the system today, 7 in 10 of them say that they support this early childhood education solution. It wasn't just those voters that were focused on someone who's quote-unquote finding solutions today. It was, in fact, those voters, when we got specific and we gave them the specific proposal, that told us that, in fact, they were strongly in support. In fact, 2 in 5 indicating intense support, even among those quote-unquote angry voters. That does have ramifications, in fact, for the election. On slide 19, you can see that a candidate's position on early education clearly does matter to voters. We asked it both ways. We asked voters to think about a candidate who was supporting this specific proposal to help states provide better early childhood education, and one who was opposing it. In both cases, voters were choosing a side. They were telling us that this alone would help define that candidate for them. In fact, 47%, almost half, told us the candidate supporting it, they would have a more favorable impression just based on this issue alone, and 2 in 5 would be have a less favorable impression of a candidate who opposed this. Again, just thinking about this issue alone, it's helping to define a significant chunk of the electorate how they feel about this. And again, those key subgroups we saw before, suburban women, Republican women, Latino voters, they were all telling us all more likely to say that this issue alone would define it. In fact, you can see that on slide 20, that 3 in 5 Hispanics, and again, those very crucial suburban women voters around the country, even seniors, the majority of seniors were telling us that they were supportive. It was even more among those key millennial voters. But all these different subgroups are saying, yeah, hearing this information about how a candidate stands on early childhood education is going to influence how I perceive that candidate moving forward in the election. Now, that's well and good, but we also know that there's 2 sides to every coin. And so we wanted to simulate, on the very next slide, some of the dialogue that could occur with this type of a significant funding proposal. And so we basically simulated some of that dialogue, asked respondents to tell us which side they tended to, which came closer to their own opinion. And as you can see, while we've tweaked some of the language over the years to mimic some of what we're hearing in sort of the political discourse, that consistently we have seen the respondents are telling us that very clearly that they are more likely to side with those who feel that this is a good idea. And in tracking this question, that has been very incredibly consistent. Moreover, even when we break down this issue, as is expressed on the next slide, we have seen that no matter what aspect of early childhood education we're focusing on, whether that is the affordability factor, whether that is something that would really focus in on infants and toddlers, whatever it is, we've had either from 90% overall for just affordability to 3/4 of the voters for voluntary home visiting, telling us that overall that they would support that, and it's supported across the partisan spectrum as is expressed here, that we have consistently seen solid support among Republicans, even more support among independents, and nearly ubiquitous support among Democrats for investments in these very specific areas that they feel that these are important. So to sum up on the next slide, we just got a few key points that we want to stress. That clearly voters, first of all, perceive a need. As Jay talked about, they are talking about the need to improve access to quality early childhood education options. In fact, they're telling us it's a priority, even when it's compared to other policy issues, even when we're focusing on college education versus early childhood education, which we know is a false choice. There ought to be something for everyone in that mix, but clearly voters are telling us, wait a minute, this ought to be something that's really a priority for us as a country, because it's the starting point for our next generation. We've seen, as I talked about, consistent support for a specific proposal, even when we are attaching a very significant price tag to that. And that's true even for those voters who are focused on seeking a candidate who sort of focuses in on their outlet for anger these days. They remain solidly in support of early childhood education investments even after they hear more about it, and really there's very little that we're seeing here that tells us that there's much risk or downside. In fact, voters across the partisan spectrum, and whether they're Trump supporters or Clinton supporters, they are telling us consistently that this is something they value. And look, this isn't the case with every issue. I mean, we can't say that enough. This is really a very unusual issue, and that it just brings voters across the partisan spectrum together, that they've all perceived a need and that they express support for investments in this area. So I think I'm supposed to pass it back to someone at this point. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Lori and Jay. And thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar, Key Findings from the National Survey on Early Learning. If you do have any questions, please contact Charlie Jockin at cjockin@ffyf.org. And on behalf of the First 5 Years Fund and our presenters, thank you for joining us today, and please enjoy the rest of your day.